Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Well, I begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Human history. Question for you all. When did Indigenous people first come to this country that we call, what was called Gondwana land? How many thousand years ago? 65,000 years ago and counting. How many years ago did us whitefellas come? 200 and a bit. So, Jackie, and to our Indigenous brothers and sisters here, it's wonderful to be able to share this continent with you. And I too share your confidence that the arc of history is bending towards justice on the delivery of treaty between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was, as it said it was, a statement from the heart. And it was a cry from Indigenous leadership right across this vast country of ours for justice. Justice in the recognition in our Constitution, number one. Justice in the entrenchment within the Constitution of a voice for Indigenous Australians. And justice through a treaty. And these things are doable within our time. And do them we must. As you probably know, I'm a son of the local soil. Good to see our local state member from Nicklin, Rob Skelton. How are you, Rob? I know this is not a partisan gathering, but thank God you won the last... And our MC, who is our former candidate for Buderim, well done, mate. Coming in with 46-47% of the vote and giving the other mob a real run for their money. So well done. And those of you from Caloundra, who's here from Caloundra today? I've got to say, Jason Hunt's outcome was terrific as well. I could say I helped with both campaigns. I did, but the reason we actually prevailed is because we had first-class candidates, so well done. So, Charmaine Twoley, thank you for inviting me to this gathering. I haven't been here on Buderim Hill for a long time. I first came up here when I was in Nambour Young People's Theatre as a slightly snotty-nosed 16-year-old. And we were performing a play up here with the Buderim Amateur Theatrical Society, then called BATS. Still called BATS? Jesus, Mary and Joseph. And I'm so glad that predated the arrival of the modern video. There is no evidence of me on stage up here at all. It would be so humiliating. So I remember being up here in Buderim in those days when we were at school. And as I've said in other gatherings locally, it's so good to be home. I was born around here, Yamundi, Nambour. My mother was born around here. She was born in Mapleton. And Mapleton? Yeah, that's right. Their farm was on the Geelong Range there. Still is. And her father arrived up here as the publican, the old commercial hotel in Nambour in 1913. So you're looking at third generation. What was called in those days North Coast. No such thing as the Sunshine Coast, let alone the sunny coast. It was the North Coast, as the Gold Coast was then called the South Coast. But it's so good to be home and to be among you. Let me talk about three things. First is what Murdoch is doing. Second, the impact on our democracy. And third, what we can do to defend public broadcasting. Three things. there is precious little debate in our country about what Murdoch actually does. And there's a reason for that. Most people are frightened of him, really frightened of him. They know that if you take Murdoch on as a public political figure, either from our party or from any other political party, the Labor Party, Liberal Party, any other political grouping, that they will come after you and they will seek to eviscerate your reputation, assassinate your character, and then rip you up into little pieces in the next morning's edition of the paper. And not just in one paper. Murdoch owns 70% of the print readership of this country. It's not just the Curious Mail, or as I call them, the Courier Fail. It's the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it's the Melbourne Herald Sun, it's the Hobart Mercury, it's the Adelaide Advertiser, it's the Australian newspaper, so-called. I call it the Un-Australian. And then here, in our fair state of Queensland, Gold Coast Bulletin, Curious Fail, what used to be the Sunshine Coast Daily until they killed it, and then partly sought to rebirth it because the reaction against their decision was so bad. But then as you head up the coast, it's the Bundaberg News Mail, it's the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin, it's the Mackay Mercury, the Townsville Bulletin, the Cairns Post, and I missed many on the way through. All 100% Murdoch rags. So when I say the reason we don't have a debate about this question in our country is in part because people are afraid, it is rational to conclude that you should be afraid because they can come after you anywhere. And beyond what they can do to you in print, they now, since the advent of Sky Television or Sky TV and Sky News, is that they now have taken into the electronic platforms. And not only is it Sky After Dark for subscribers and all the crazies who inhabit that slot, it's now replayed through their own YouTube channel. And Sky News' new YouTube channel now is twice as big as the ABC's, and it is 4 times as big as 9. On top of that, you have the arrangement entered into and allowed by the Morrison government for Sky News and all that content, that vile, racist, climate change denialist, public health distorting presentation that you get on Sky Television. They now have an arrangement whereby through Win and Prime, regional commercial television networks, that content right across Australia is now broadcast as well on mainstream free-to-air television. So therefore, it's not just the Curious Fail. It's not just the local Murdoch rag, wherever you are in the country. It is now across YouTube, and now the biggest news platform on YouTube for Australia, with literally hundreds of millions of views. But also now, since August, barely 2 months ago, through the regional television free-to-air networks. So again, I go back to my proposition, why are people afraid? It's not just picking up your morning newspaper, it's knowing that they'll eviscerate you after dark as well. And with a vicious array of television presenters, all of whom have come out of the American Fox News stable of training and personal improvement. So why is Murdoch doing this? I've often thought this because I've met Murdoch many times. I've met Rupert quite a lot. I've met his son Lachlan quite a lot. I've met the powers that be there quite a lot. My best summary for someone who's had to wrestle with the beast up close is that it's about this. Number one, Murdoch has a deep fascination just with power for its own sake. A little insight, when Trump won the presidency in the United States, largely through the backing of Murdoch's Fox network in the United States, and I lived through that whole campaign in America, I saw it every night on the box. the very first interview that Trump was granted to anybody straight after he won the election was obviously with Fox. And normally you would send your journalist or your reporter and they go and do the interview. But Murdoch couldn't resist it. Couldn't resist it. There he was, lurking in the Oval Office as this shadow in the background because of his addiction to power. A bit like Gollum, you know? Precious, my precious. You know? A bit like Gollum. Another small insight. Since I've been in the United States, and when President Obama was still in office, I was invited to a luncheon in Washington. And it turned out to be a reasonably small group. Public policy types, think tankers like me and a few others. People from the Congress, people from the administration. And but the overall political hue of the occasion was more conservative than it was progressive. So the President of the United States arrives, and I actually didn't even know he was coming. And our hosts, realising that on his guest list of about 50, so it's a little backyard thing in the middle of Washington DC, says, "My God, I've got two Aussies coming, you and Rupert. We put you on the same table." Think of it. And my mum always said in Nambour, if you can't say anything nice about Nambour, say nothing at all. That's her training from the Yamundi CWA. And so I look at this guy, and he looks at me, because this is barely a year or so after their appalling Murdoch campaign during the 2013 election, which you may remember had me dressed up as a Nazi and all sorts of things, on the front page of the newspapers. And so then Barack Obama arrives, and he looks at this group, and he's going, I can see him saying to himself, "Oh, why am I here?" And so he sees me, because we'd known each other in office, and he comes over and says hi. And then we disappear to one corner of the room and just catch up. And I won't go into what he said, but it had something to do with why are we here. But what I found fascinating in terms of Gollum, and I reckon Rupert looks like Gollum. You think about it. The Gollum on a bad day. And so the president was whisked off to the top table. I was down with the other ranks, with Rupert. But as soon as the president left, the guy who made a beeline for me was Murdoch. First question, what did he say? To which my response was, "Rupert, why would I tell you? Give me one good reason why I would tell you what the President of the United States had to say to me. You campaign against both of us." Yeah, but what did he say? So this fascination with power is, I think, a key insight into this individual's personality. Second, however, it's not just power for its own sake, it's power to make money. And Murdoch and his commercial interests lie at the absolute epicenter of his worldview. So if you stand in the road of those commercial interests, just watch out, because there is a thundering great semi-trailer heading down the road to take you out. And then if you're still there, to reverse over the top of you. That was my experience with the National Broadband Network. For those of you who may not recall, the National Broadband Network, which we launched in 2008-9, was to be fibre optic to the premises across the entire country, $42 billion program, as big as the building of the National Railway System. And we began rolling it out in 2009. To this day, by the way, if you travel to regional Tasmania and to the Northern Territory, where we started the rollout first, it's all fibre optic to the premises, 100 megabits per plus per second. Best broadband in the country, A-grade broadband. And then the other mob, Abbott, ripped it up and turned it into fibre optic to the node. I don't know about you, but I haven't found a node yet. It's a bit like purgatory if you're a Roman Catholic. It's out there somewhere, okay? Not quite sure where. It's between somewhere and something, okay? But you can never quite find the node. Next time you're speaking to your local Liberal National Party Member of Parliament, ask them, where is the node? Because none of us know what the bloody node is. But why did Abbott do it that way? He did it so that the final link between the node, somewhere in your suburb, and the premises would be copper in order to slow down your broadband delivery to your home, to your office, to your hospital, or to wherever. Why? Very simple. Murdoch did not want fibre optic cable, 100 megabits plus per second, going to every household in the country because it would provide Netflix back then with immediate and automatic competitive access to the home movie entertainment market. So you ask yourself why it changed? That's it. Not a fabrication from me. I've spoken to far too many people who have been privy to the decisions at the time. And so this $42 billion project of ours was then scuttled by Abbott as part of an agreement in the 2013 election. If you want further evidence of this, where was the coalition's, the LNP's, federal launch held for its national broadband policy? Fox Studios in Sydney. Shameless. Like they didn't even pretend. And now a wholly owned subsidiary of News Corporation International, the Liberal Party, will now launch its broadband policy to you, the Australian people. So not only the result of which is massive national financial waste, substandard broadband to 3/4 of the country, and all because of a grubby deal between the Liberals and Murdoch. So when I say Murdoch is driven by two animating forces, it's the Gollum factor, power, power. But remember when Gollum is playing with the keys, it's my precious, because it's also money and money. Power and money, that's it, that's Murdoch, that's the future. The ideology comes third, but it reinforces the first and the second. And the ideology is government preferably should not exist. 2, if it does exist, it should be as tiny as possible. 3, so that there are minimal taxes on me, so that I can maximise my power and money. 4, there shall be minimum regulations, particularly those affecting my bottom line, namely workplace relations, namely labour laws. And 5, I'm part of a broader far-right ideological movement which believes that climate change is a hoax. That, in a nutshell, is his worldview. And that is what we're dealing with. And I have just this simple view, as a boy from Nambour, that is off, just really off. And we should not stand by and simply tolerate it for the future. So therefore, that explains why I launched, when I came back to Australia at the beginning of COVID about 18 months ago, I actually sat back and observed the Murdoch media once again in full daily operation. And it even deteriorated from when I left office at the end of 2013. I thought, my God, this country is going down the American road. And if you've observed the Fox phenomenon in the United States, let us have a little window into the future. The window into the future is this. Leaving aside those financial and power-driven motivations that I just described before on the part of the proprietor and owner, Murdoch 1 and Murdoch 2. Not as nice as B1 and B2. What it does as its business model is this. Through Fox, they've decided that if you identify an inherently conservative group of people and then target them relentlessly with a key set of highly conservative, far-right and progressively extremist views, you actually start to stitch them on as a loyal following to the network and a loyal following to that set of ideas over time. And you also seek at the same time to decouple them from any other sources of news which might challenge the veracity of the far-right ideological agenda which is being presented through Fox. So that not only do you maximise the solidity of the commercial base of subscribers to Fox in the United States and grow the business, you then cause them to turn off other sources of news and therefore other sources of advertising as well. So this model, driven by commerce and driven by his naked self-interest in securing an inherently conservative subscriber base and growing it on the basis of feeding them as much raw meat as possible, unsubstantiated, and cutting them off from the rest of, let's call it, the news world. He's proven over 30 years' experience in the United States, quote, works, unquote. Because what happens? It grows and grows. It's become from nothing the single biggest cable television network in the United States. And in the United States also repeated on free-to-air in regional America, the model I was referring to just here before. Also, obviously, through YouTube and the other technology platforms. But the net consequence is something Murdoch couldn't care less about. The net consequence is this, that you produce in a democracy a set of warring tribes, them and us, and never the twain shall meet. And the basis for discourse and discussion between those who may come from a more conservative worldview, a more progressive worldview, and the various shades in between is slowly rent asunder because it doesn't fit the business model. You wanted us versus them. Last time you watched Sky Television, it's us versus them. It's us truth tellers, Andrew Bolt, Alan Jones, Peter Credlin, forefront of the truth against those dreadful liberals who watch the public broadcast of the ABC. That's the binary world which they seek to establish because it serves the business model and it's the model they've proven to be commercially successful in the United States. The outplay and the outcome of all of the above is what we saw in Washington DC on the 6th of January this year. When the rabble so created by this phenomenon and used and abused by Trump and aided and abetted by Murdoch, accepted the proposition from Trump that the election had been stolen and that it was their patriotic duty to storm the Capitol and to seize power back from those who were betraying the Constitution and the founding documents of the American Republic. And so he had unleashed thousands of violent protesters onto the Capitol. And if you've read that most recent account by Bob Woodward entitled Peril, it details this last period between the presidential election in November of 2020 and the inauguration of Biden on the 20th of January 21. And the perilous time which ensued when Trump, again aided and abetted by Murdoch's Fox, challenged the legitimacy of an electoral outcome, mobilised a violent force, fed them lies, detached them from reality, and then when it all happened, it all unfolded, and blood was shed on the Capitol, pretended that he had nothing to do with it. That is the evil nature of what is unfolding in our country as well. And so you ask the question, why do folks like me stick their hand up and say, enough is enough? I've seen what the future is, because I've been living in America. I've seen what happens. It's a very bad play. much worse than the one I performed in up here in Buderim some time ago. It's a very bad play indeed. A very bad play indeed. One other thought, which I think is important for us to reflect on. It's not just the motivations of this publisher and proprietor based on power and greed. It's not just the worldview, which is far right and extremist and climate change denialist. It is not just his capacity to divide our country into warring tribes incapable of normal discourse. It is that it is an assault on the very notion of objective truth itself. Facts no longer exist. Everything is opinion. So much so that opinion is now allowed to bleed into fact. When you've looked at the front pages of Murdoch or watched Sky After Dark, there's no news there. It's opinion dressed up as news. And when that happens, and you detach a reading public or a viewing public from the idea that a proposition to be accepted as a matter of fact has to be proven with evidence, you're in very dangerous territory, because everything then is relative. Black becomes white, white becomes black, and that, as we know from history, is when the propagandists take over completely, as we saw unfolding in America on the 6th of January. And the sustainability of a democracy, when we no longer have facts established by evidence as the basis for our debate, which then brings to bear different political opinion based on those facts, then we no longer have a foundation for democracy. So again, you ask the question, why have I dusted off the cobwebs and re-entered the fray on this question? That's it. I've seen where this movie ends, and it's a really bad movie. When I put out the petition to be signed by Australians, calling for a Murdoch Royal Commission, most of my staff thought I was balmy because they thought we'd get a few thousand interested locals. That's about it. But as the meter ticked by and we got 100,000 signatures and then 200,000 signatures and 300,000 signatures and 400,000 signatures and then 500,000 signatures, and becoming the single largest digital petition in the history of the Australian Parliament, I think finally the political class in this country woke up to the fact that the people have had enough of this man having so much power and having too much power in our country. So for those of you who signed that petition, thank you. I really do appreciate the support. And the final element of that, so that you think it's not simply a 1-minute wonder, is that it actually fed into the Senate inquiry into media diversity, which is still ongoing. It's been going now for 12 months. And for the first time, the News Corporation executives have been hauled before the Senate to answer basic questions. What are you doing? How do you organise your news? What about fact and opinion? Do you take instructions from Rupert? Oh no, you don't take instructions from Rupert. Hand on my heart. Pigs just flew by. And even Mad Boris Whitaker, who is the head honcho at Sky News, had to appear recently. And Mad Boris is a phenomenon to behold because he is so out there as a defender of the outrageousness of the Murdoch proposition, but without any polish to him, so that it's there just in its raw, basic ugliness. But the key point is this: the Senate will draw their inquiry to a close, I'm advised, around about November, and will be within their purview whether or not to recommend to the Parliament, and therefore to the government, whether there should be a Royal Commission. So we will come down to a formal parliamentary resolution on whether there should be a Royal Commission into Murdoch's media monopoly by the end of November. And then it enters the political fray in terms of what happens in the federal election. So there is a method to our collective madness in terms of a petition, mobilisation, Senate inquiry. I've appeared before now twice as a witness, and others have as well, including former News Corporation journalists. and it now comes to a point of crunch by the end of November. I said I'd talk about 3 things. I've only spoken about 1, so I'm going to give you 60 seconds on the remaining 2. And then any questions that you would care to ask. Please, anyone in front of me who's letting their pav get cold, please eat it. So my auntie Phyllis always said, never let your pav get cold. She was from Yamundi too. She used to teach pav preparation at the Yamundi CWA. My auntie Phyllis's pavs were to be dreamed of. And she always said you could never cook a pav on a rainy day, is that right? Yeah, that's right, yes. Very, very Queensland wisdom there. Anyways, we all reflect where we would have secured our knowledge from. The democracy and the consequences of what I've described, I believe, are dire. And I think we are now at a stage where the outcome of the next federal election is of elemental importance for the country's future. This is not an ordinary election. It is not just what the Morrison government is doing or not doing vis-a-vis the pandemic, vis-a-vis nuclear-powered submarines, vis-a-vis climate change. These are matters for a separate debate and separate discussion. I'm happy to do that in Q&A. But on the elementals of our democracy, which affects the country's future and our ability to have an intelligent, seasoned, reasonable debate about each of the above, it is of fundamental importance that this Murdoch beast is tackled to the ground. And finally, Auntie. I'm pleased to say that as Prime Minister, our funding curve for the ABC went like that. I think Charmaine would be the independent attestation of it. Secondly, we legislated to give the ABC full editorial independence and independence reflected through the composition of the board. Legislation subsequently ignored by the current government. We did not want the ABC to be the subject of rolling politicisation by the appointment of former politicians from either side. We wanted the ABC to be autonomous in fact, in the name and in perception. And that's why the ABC Reform Act did that, and which we honoured in office and which has been dishonoured since the current government has been in. How do they avoid the law? They use an independent panel to produce nominations for the board, for which there are about 10 sets of criteria, including knowledge of, broadcasting and the rest. And then they exploit a loophole in the Act, which is, having considered the nominations of the independent panel, they then ignore them and appoint whomever they wish. But what really bugs me about this mob is this. They're ultimately cowards, the Morrison government. They are seeking to do to the ABC what they've sought to do to Medicare, what they're seeking to do to the NDIS, which is to kill it by stealth through the back door. In other words, to incrementally defund it and to delegitimise it over time. If you look at aggregate federal funding for the ABC, year by year, being collapsed. Since we left office, I think effectively $700 million out of its budget. And that's a powerful amount of programming. But similarly with Medicare, never with the guts to say up front, I want to kill universal health insurance, just defund it and decrease the number of GPs, therefore, who provide it. Another reform of the Labor government, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. My idea, and prosecuted also by Julia Gillard. Again, they don't have the guts to say, we've got to kill the NDIS. Instead, they'll seek to defund it by the back door. So friends, for us to succeed as a democracy, not only do we need to wrestle the Murdoch beast to the ground, we need to enhance the independence and the scope and the powers and the reach of the Australian Broadcasting Commission. I have an idea about how that should be done. If we form the next government of Australia, then what should be done is that the budget for the ABC, at a reasonable historical level, in real terms, perhaps that which it reached by the time we left office in 2013, should then be anchored in real terms in legislation, in the law, so that they cannot simply adjust the budget backwards on budget night when everyone's focus is on everything else. That they would have to get an amendment to the ABC Funding Act through the House, which they could if they are the government again in the future, but through the Senate, and putting on the line each and every one of those One Nation, National Party and other senators, all of whom who come from constituencies in the bush and the regions, who also depend on the ABC. Much harder proposition to get it through the Senate. And they'd have to own it up front through a legislative act they wanted to kill ABC funding. We can no longer trust in the bona fides of this mob. We've got to use the law, the institutions of the Parliament, to entrench the funding of the national broadcaster. Critical for the future of our democracy. Thank you.